Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MedTech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn.
And we're your hosts of the show.
So today on the MedTech Impact Podcast, we're delighted to be joined by Teresa Prego, CEO of EpiWatch. Teresa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So excited to be here, you guys.
Hey, well, we're so excited to have you on. You were a keynote at one of the M2D2 events, and you have so much experience, so many great insights to share. And so it's amazing to have you on here to share some of that wisdom with the audience. But of course, we're here to talk about EpiWatch. And when we start off, we always want to talk about the big problem being solved. So what is that big problem that EpiWatch is looking to address?
So for us, it's for the 3.7 million Americans in the US living with epilepsy and 65 million globally. Management of the condition is important. And for the roughly 40% who are refractory, meaning they're not responsive to epilepsy meds, the risk of injury and death from seizures is high. Sudden death from epilepsy is the number 2 cause of neurologic death in the US. Yet so few people have heard about it, understand it. Even people living with epilepsy may or may not have had a discussion with their clinician about it. So EpiWatch is about detecting and alerting for seizures and alerting a caregiver network of seizure activity. And our number 1 focus is really the prevention, hopefully, or at least mitigation of injury and death from seizures and the reduction of SUDEP.
I mean, those numbers are just staggering. We're talking about, 1% of the population, nearly 500,000 age under 18 are affected by this. And so you think about just, the impact that has not only on the patients, but obviously the people around them. It is significant. What are some of the costs involved? I know you mentioned, trying to prevent some of the seizure activity or the side effects of the seizure activity.
Yeah, so there's the sort of the cost of care for these individuals. So often with a seizure, if the appropriate person isn't there able to respond, an ambulance is called. So ED visits, hospitalizations as a result of a seizure, and then just the anxiety and well-being of not just the individual, but their entire family and caregiver network. So, concern that a seizure will happen when they're not there. For kids in school, concern that the rescue meds are with the school nurse. The kid is in the classroom, will everything happen in a timely fashion? So there's that sort of emotional well-being cost in addition to the cost of care, and then just time lost. So parents who work, need to manage their child. Individuals who have epilepsy and are in a work environment, making sure that they're able to be safe and feel safe, and just the risk of behavioral health issues, anxiety, depression related to epilepsy are extremely high. So there's a huge sort of not directly the seizure, but related to the seizure cost.
Yeah, Kyle, I think, for those sort of statistics, you can understand that a lot of us will know somebody who has epilepsy, and we can really understand that emotional effect that Teresa was talking about there.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And it's an interesting point, I mean, I'm thinking about these folks too that might struggle from epilepsy, but I personally don't really understand how, people with epilepsy are currently managing their conditions today. So maybe, Teresa, you could kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's really largely managed via drugs. So it's a pharmaceutical solution, has been the case. There are now some emerging new technologies, deep brain stimulation, responsive neurostimulation. That's still a small portion of the individuals who have not been responsive to drugs, who've received those types of implants to help to manage. And there's more genetic therapy on the horizon, but I think the soonest any of those will come out is 2026. So it's really, you nailed it, Kyle. It's about managing. There's nothing curative, really, unless you have a resective surgery that hopefully, resolves the seizures. But it's all about managing the condition, trying different drugs. And that's a huge one. One drug doesn't work, so you try another one. And that's an exhausting process because the side effects of some of these drugs are also not great. They can cause additionally anxiety, depression, weight gain, weight loss, so trying to manage all that is time consuming, and emotionally, I think just it takes a lot out of people. If you're the lucky one that, you try the first drug and it works, then that's great. But even then, sometimes there's a honeymoon period and the drug isn't effective after a certain amount of time. So there's always an underlying anxiety with living with the condition. And we're trying to, provide some solutions that we can apply technology to the management of epilepsy and really try to, we're not curing it, but can we make it better?
Well, that's a good point. So let's talk about then your platform called EpiWatch. How is EpiWatch helping?
So EpiWatch is the result of a collaboration with Apple, Johns Hopkins, and EpiWatch. And so we have created an algorithm. It runs on Apple Watch's platform. And what it does is detects and alerts for tonic-clonic seizure activity. So the individual wears a extremely wearable Apple Watch, and Apple has, put hundreds of thousands of hours into the development of something that's very wearable. And that creates this network because when you set up the app, you put your contacts in and they'll be notified if there's seizure activity. That can include a school nurse, campus safety, if it's a kid in college. So you create this network of notification. And when the watch detects a seizure activity, I'm going to turn it on. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this, but it alarms the individuals in your network, but it also audibly alarms. So if there's someone around you that doesn't know what's going on, and also sets off all my phones, sorry about that.
Okay.
But that is, that says, hey, there's something going on here. So now we're working with, there's a group called the Epilepsy Alliance that has a seizure action plan. And they've got this little QR code that you can scan to get that person's plan. So, near term, you can put it on your watch band, right? And so if that audible alarm goes off, you got the scan code, your network's alerted. So we're really working hard to say, okay, when someone's having a seizure, can we get them assistance sooner rather than later? Because I don't know if you've ever been around anyone that had a seizure and everyone stands around not knowing what to do.
Sure.
It's it's a tough situation because the individual can't say, hey, I'm having a seizure. Here's what needs to happen. So
Mhm.
you're really reliant on others. So we're trying to better manage that, and also just let the caregiver network know that something's happening.
Sure. So this is an effort really, to improve that reaction time initially, right? To help, patients get the treatment and the help they need as soon as possible. Now, what about the proactive side? How do you see EpiWatch evolving now, in the future to take more of a proactive approach to maybe identifying and treating before a seizure occurs?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that we're doing. So not only are we detecting and alerting, but we're also passively and objectively measuring seizure activity. So we've got this data of seizure activity that can be downloaded, shared with a clinician. So many years ago in my youth, I worked in the diabetes business when continuous glucose monitoring was just coming into the marketplace. So I see these two things as pretty similar. That, the ability to manage and monitor glucose is life-threatening for people living with type 1 diabetes. Same thing here. We're continuously monitoring that seizure activity because right now the standard of care is you go in, you visit your clinician, they say, how have things been since your last visit? How many seizures? What type of seizures? That's really hard for patients to self-report that. Pretty hard for caregivers even to accurately report that. So now we're providing that objective data. And then our hope, of course, is that we can, with the data, with the understanding of what that individual's seizure cycle looks like, get to a more predictive
Mhm.
capability. Definitely not there yet, but can we say, hey, it's looking like your physiologic triggers are happening, so get to a safe spot. Or alerting their caregivers, hey, it's looking like a high risk period. So, that would be, I think, the ideal, not just you're having a seizure, but hey, your risk is high for a seizure right now.
Another thing you mentioned, like the only sort of approach currently is with medication. So how do you think about medication adherence? Is that a problem that you could sort of, latch onto or channel partner or you're directly looking to solve in terms of just better understanding of, when good adherence exists or not?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and there's a lot of seizure diaries out there that look at, did you take your meds? People get really fatigued about, going in and doing that. So can we put on the watch? Took my meds today? Absolutely.
Mm.
It's a one tap button. I had a different wearable that I worked with in the past for Parkinson's. We definitely had that on there. Interesting side note on that one, you could also identify OCD issues with that person because they would tap I took my meds about 20
Mhm.
times in a row, and we started to realize that, okay, we're seeing something different here. But so easy to sort of integrate into a patient diary. When they're changing meds, that's when it's key because people are much more
Mm.
compliant about, did I take this med? Did I not take this med? And what's the seizure activity looking like? I think that's a huge one, is medication titration, which happens a lot with epilepsy, and using EpiWatch to help with the management and the monitoring of that activity.
And I guess what we're really talking about here is the behavioral aspect of any condition and how you manage it. And what I really love about this solution is how easily it integrates because, the fact that you're embedded into a watch and so many of us are now accustomed to smartwatches. And so it's just a natural sort of evolution where we think, hey, well, I'm already wearing a watch. The fact that this can add value and potentially save my life, it's just seems such a normal thing to do, which I think for your success factor is, a big driver. So in terms of where you are now, what's the latest for the company?
So we have just submitted our 510(k) to FDA. So we're in that anxious waiting period to see what questions come back and, where they are looking at our clinical study data. So we did a 5-site clinical study, very, very good results. So good seizure detection, low false alarm rate, because that's one of the things when you're talking about wearables, if it keeps false alarming, then the wear utilization goes down. So we had a really low false alarm rate to go with the good detection. So we're feeling very good. I'm knocking on wood, but we're looking at being able to then hopefully launch in next year outside of clinical studies. So we're used in clinical studies right now because we don't have the FDA clearance. So we want to go broad because this is way more valuable to people living in the real world than people spending time in an epilepsy monitoring unit.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing just hearing you talk about this because as much as obviously this is a solution for the patient, again, you mentioned this at the beginning, this is a solution for all the family, the friends, the caregivers around them, just to have that extra level of comfort. And so what's that process like in terms of, when you're on the market, is it simple as just downloading an app or is there anything else you need to do?
So we've put it through the FDA as a prescription only device, because we want to make sure that at least initially that clinicians are involved. You don't want to have people sort of self-diagnosing seizures. Although I think it's less likely in this case than something like an EKG where you're self-diagnosing arrhythmia based on Apple Watch data. But so we want to have the clinician involved. But then, yeah, you download it, you set up your account. You set up your caregivers. You can edit those caregivers at any point in time. We're working on can you set the hours for the caregivers with the school nurse in mind? Because they may or may not want to be notified on the weekend of seizure activity of one of their charges. Um, and then also looking at for a group home setting, for example, how do you manage people with seizures in that kind of setting? Because the Apple Watch is really sort of it's ideal for a one-on-one relationship with the user, but it also has the power to be a monitor for different types of settings where it's a wearer, maybe many wearers to one moderator kind of setting. So we're working on that approach as well. But initially it really is it's a parent caregiver with their loved one, child, as the target audience.
And would your app and the platform there, would that communicate to, the patient kind of like an Athena Health, for example? How about that, right? Would it communicate with that type of platform so that, clinicians are able to access this information easily and it's kind of part of that customer profile or not customer, but patient profile in a way?
Yeah. So for the electronic health record, right now where you can download to a PDF, which can be put in the notes section, that relationship to go directly into the EHR is a complex one, requires interfaces. And to be honest, there are so many out there. I mean, if you're talking about a large healthcare system, it's probably Epic. And if you're talking about a clinical practice, it may be Athena. So there's so many that right now we're doing it sort of almost, it's not manual, but it's PDF put into notes. Not ideal long term. And we'll probably go through a third party integrator rather than us trying to do it. But it would be great if there were an open system for that. I mean, in my ideal world, I don't have to deal with all those different EHRs. I've got sort of one common way to share that information.
Sure, that makes sense. And what about like the reimbursement side?
Yeah, great question. So right now, wearables are not typically reimbursed. As part of the reason that we put it through FDA as prescription only, because that will lend a higher likelihood of reimbursement ultimately. And so we're going to push to have it reimbursed. It'll start as a subscription model for the individual. We've also worked with epilepsy advocacy groups. Danny did, Sophie's Journey, the Chelsea Hutchinson Foundation have all agreed to reimburse people who cannot afford this for the purchase of an Apple Watch if needed, as well as for the annual subscription. So that's huge. But ideally, you would get this paid for. There's only one state right now that reimburses for this. That's Minnesota. And it's reimbursed like durable medical equipment. So think of a sleep apnea kind of a machine. So that's what we're pushing for. There's a bill in Congress and the House for the national plan for epilepsies. So there's a lot of advocacy and push to really gain attention, reimbursement, and research dollars for epilepsy right now.
It's incredible to seeing or thinking about the potential for this because clearly you have this immediate impact in terms of, better management, better monitoring, better notification. But of course, as this scales, you could see that just all the data you're going to gather. So how do you think about that longer term data play and where you could take this?
I think that's huge because not enough work has been done in epilepsy to really understand, what are the epileptogenic networks that are causing these seizures? What are the biomarkers? I mean, there's physiologic biomarkers. The EEG is sort of the standard of care right now, but how do we get beyond that to something that's more wearable? You can't go around with a 24 lead EEG on your scalp all the time. So how do we get to, what other data is out there? And it's really only by the sort of massive collection of good data around seizures that you can get to something like that. So I'm pretty excited about the longer term data opportunity. But first we've got to get there, with sort of safety, security, and objective measurement of seizure data.
Yeah, Kyle, I could just imagine, I'm wearing my smartwatch and I'm sure a lot of people who are listening are wearing a watch, but as we move forward with technology and we just adopt more wearables and become more comfortable with them, I can imagine that there's so many channel partners you could have with this. So is there people you're already talking to or people you've got your eye on going, hey, I'd love to work with them?
There are, yeah, and they're diverse too. So there's of course pharma partners, right? And particularly the ones with sort of the urgent medications or what used to be termed rescue medications. So can you get an alert and then a rescue med? Like if they're on, a specific nasal rescue med, can the watch actually say administer rescue med? Can you count down the time of the seizure? Because a lot of the rescue meds say wait 2 minutes. So, it's at 2 minutes, administer if needed, kind of a thing. And then there's the device manufacturers. So deep brain stimulation, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, can we create sort of this closed loop kind of opportunity? LivaNova has the VNS, which is you can run a magnet to send an extra stimulation. That's another one. And then I think there's also probably someone we're not thinking about, in the traditional model. So Dexcom, are they getting into, other areas of understanding the impact of continuous monitoring? I think the answer is yes there. So yes, they would be a candidate. And then some of the just sort of the data management and, the search for biomarkers. So someone like Beacon Biosignal, where they're all about sort of gathering sleep data, EEG data, and looking at then what can be created. So yeah, and I think longer term, that's where EpiWatch belongs. That we can build it to a certain level, but then it needs to be part of a bigger ecosystem.
That's a really interesting. I really, Richard, I thought that was brilliant. That reference to how many wearables there are today out there, and Teresa, you did such a great job at kind of aligning, your platform with those wearables and how you all can work together. I think of even that Aurora ring, I think it's called, where, you wear a ring and it tells you, all your sleep patterns. So as I started thinking about it, I'm like, wow, there really are several wearable technologies. And obviously, we've seen in the wearable space over the last 5 years just a massive explosion and innovation in that space. So that's a really exciting future. I'm really curious too, because it sounds like the clinician is such an important part of this. So I'd love to kind of have you help us understand and realize, like, why is this so important to clinicians as well? How is it going to help in their job and their workflows, and how is it going to make them better too in their job, as well as obviously making these patients better? But what's the value really in for them?
Yeah, so in any relationship with an individual living with a chronic condition, there's this partnership of clinician, clinical staff who play a huge role because they're often the ones taking the calls from patients and patient families, and then the patient and their family. So this creates a better touch point, I think, for the clinician to understand, okay, what's happening with the individual, and it creates a better communication pathway for the individual and their family to say, okay, here's exactly what's been happening, without trying to, like, open the notebook and go through, or look at a calendar and say, okay, here's exactly what happened. And then the key is getting the information formatted in a way that it's valuable to the clinician. So a long list of seizure activity, probably not the best thing for them to look at. So looking at, what is sort of the cycle been, what are the outliers? If they're changing medications, what does it look like before and after? So I think it's a huge communication enhancer. I also think it is an education platform for clinicians. So, we talked earlier that clinicians don't necessarily like to talk about SUDEP, but what if you talk about, hey, there's a risk of SUDEP. Here's a wearable, a way to monitor that you might want to think about. It makes for an easier conversation and education session potentially than just saying, hey, there's a risk of death and you should know about it. Instead, you can say there is a risk of death, but there's also things you can do about it. So I think it changes the conversation in that way. And then longer term, it gives them better data about that individual. And over time, what are their responses to medication been? Because there's often, when you ask someone who's changed to a new medication, there's a halo effect of they will believe that it's had an impact on seizure activity because they really want it to. But is that the case? So I think it really enhances that partnership. And for the clinicians, it gives them, for the first time, really, unless the patient has been in an epilepsy monitoring unit and has EEG data to look at, it gives them real objective data to include in their clinical decision making.
Yeah, I can see how that could add so much value. And you mentioned those words, objective data, because we're just kind of drowning in data right now. And so you really need to hone in on, what is that critical data that can add value to the decision-making process to improve the patient outcomes. But it clearly sounds you have a lot of this mapped out, and a lot of exciting opportunities, some of the big names you mentioned in the industry. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about, the next 6 to 18 months, what's coming up, what are some of those big milestones, how are you sort of integrating with those bigger providers?
Yeah, so well, clearly, getting through FDA is a huge milestone for us. So submission is half the battle, and then clearance really is what matters to any of the larger players, because they really want that sort of checkbox done. It reduces the risk significantly, and then it's really proof of concept, proof of traction in the marketplace. So we have a wait list. We know there's demand, but we also need sort of, the proof of the concept that beyond clinical studies, people are keeping this on. It's detecting, alerting, people are able to take action. We'd love to get the economic data to back that up. So we're working to find some clinical network partners where we can see, what was the cost of care for that individual pre-wearing EpiWatch, and then what's the cost of care? Have there been reduction in ED visits? hospitalizations, better compliance, just from a payer perspective, they're going to want that economic validation as well. So that's one of our areas of focus, is to find clinical partners to work with on that. And then, from the therapy providers perspective, we continue to update them on where we are, how we might be able to do a pilot. If they've got a new drug launching, can we be part of that? So those conversations continue. And then we're also next year looking to do a venture raise. So I'll be out and about and, talking about EpiWatch and hoping to get venture dollars in, because we've been completely angel funded to date. But to really scale, we need to get venture dollars in.
Well, Kyle, I think Teresa must have read my mind, because I was just thinking about, your CEO raising money is never too far from your thoughts, I'm sure. And
Never.
but it's great to know that you've got so many boxes ticked in terms of like the potential, and you've got this waiting list of people who want to get on this. And so I'm sure that's going to be exciting for investors to hear about, thinking ahead a little bit more in terms of like that opportunity for investors. Are you focusing just on a local market to get started, or how are you thinking in terms of like that wider go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, so it's the US market only. So we're not looking at, outside the US, although I would love to at some point, because Australia and the UK already reimburse for wearables. So when we expand, those are two markets that are pretty attractive to us. But will probably be a bit regional. So we want to have a mix of networks with a level 4 epilepsy center, so a high level of care. But then we also want, probably somewhere mid-US, a large community network. So a lot of people with epilepsy never make it to a level 4 center or a fellowship trained epileptologist, but are cared for in a community setting by a neurologist who may or may not specialize in epilepsy. And that's a sweet spot, we think, for us, is to get to those, large community groups that, like, if you think of like Geisinger/Kaiser now, someone like that, where, their people that they serve are all over. They tend to be geographically distributed, harder to manage. You can't always get them into the clinic for a visit. So we think that's an opportunity as well. So we'll do a limited market release and target probably 3 to 5 key partnerships to really get going and understand the utilization and the economics, and then build from there.
And how about your team? What about maybe potential strategic hires in the future? Is there anyone that you're looking for specifically?
Yeah, so we're going to need to enhance our software team a bit. We have our lead developer and co-founder who is going to need some help to scale this. We're also going to need some, a couple of commercialization resources. So right now, everything is outsourced, and it's a lot of, managing contractors. So we're going to need somebody to focus there and customer support too, because people will have questions. And I think if you fail on the customer support at launch, then you fail.
Yeah,
so
that's a
we've
really
got to pay
good point.
attention.
And what about the
Yeah.
next, like say 5 years? What's that vision look like?
So first 3 years, we're really focused on building in the US, detect, alert, and addition of other types of seizures, other indications. Year like 4, 5, we'd love to go out into Europe. And I mentioned Australia and the UK, but France, also a great model for care. And when you're dealing with a nationalized healthcare system, the reimbursement is different. And so probably going into markets where reimbursement for wearables and the concept of a traveling epilepsy nurse is already in place, because that's just really friendly for adoption.
It's exciting though. I mean, there's just clearly so much potential for this, and I feel like you're riding so many trends. I mean, Kyle, we probably mentioned this a lot, but we had Jeff DeLulo from the CEO of Philips North America on in the summer, and I was talking about their future health index. And again, solutions like this address so many of the current acute problems in healthcare around shortage of staff, shortages of insights, but also these healthcare deserts. You spoke about targeting out in the Midwest. Thinking about how do you provide that same quality of care to everyone to make the solutions accessible and inclusive. And so clearly something like that can really address some of the significant problems we face.
Agree. Yeah. I mean, I think like Arkansas has one epileptologist for the entire state. So clearly everybody's not going to be treated by that individual. But so then how do you manage care, and how do you help people better self-manage? Because I think that's also a key with any of these chronic conditions like diabetes, like epilepsy, like Parkinson's, is the ability to self-manage, and what tools are we giving those individuals and their families to better manage their conditions. So EpiWatch is one of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure people listening in, if they weren't already primed beforehand, so whether that's a patient, whether that's a provider, whether that's somebody with some loose change or maybe some deeper pockets to help out, like what's the best way to get in touch with you?
So, give me a shout at tprego@epiwatch.com. Visit the website. I am here ready to have the conversation. And I'm also out and about at Epilepsy Foundation events, epilepsy awareness events. So we're really trying to sort of grassroots it and be at all of these advocacy events. And I've had some great conversations with families, clinicians, other tech providers at these outings. So I'd encourage people that if you or a family member is living with epilepsy, come out and join some of these events. I think they're awesome.
Well, thank you, Teresa. Thank you for what you're doing. And this being National Epilepsy Awareness Month, what better time to have you on and to share this discussion. So wishing you well, and of course the team well in this mission.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the conversation and always enjoy talking to the two of you. So thanks for the opportunity.
Super. Well, ladies and gentlemen, another huge thank you to Teresa Prego, CEO of EpiWatch, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the MedTech Impact Podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn. Until next time, keep innovating.